long, and these two are by him, and then we also have one of our participants here, which we can kind of go from step by step, as well as another one here. Back to our discussion. We have, I think we've discussed a little bit about why we decided to select Liu, but essentially I think it has to do a lot with how his composition really conveys the story at hand. It really brings you into his story through the way he frames the photograph. What the people are doing inside the photograph is very revealing without us even having to explain. Here it's even how, you know, the composition works with the way the ship's kind of beam is being kind of drawing your eye from this man to like the people who are trying to pick up the net. So I think there's a lot of movement behind this photograph, and even the sense of the mood of the environment, the ocean and sky, all kind of comes together in a very powerful way. Same here, like discussed before. I think one thing that we have been discussing a lot during the forum is how the very personal narratives of the China-Africa side is not really talked a lot about. Instead, we get a lot of numbers, we get a lot of economic data, we get a lot of propaganda from both sides, but we don't really get a lot of these moments like here where a Chinese fisherman is giving out a cigarette to his colleagues. So I think this is really a really intimate moment and a very personal side of the China-Africa relation that we don't really see enough of. And so I think this is why it's so good. And even the way you see a little bit of the glimpse of the fire, so that he really captures it at the right moment when he's sharing that with his colleagues. And so I think even just this image itself is very powerful. If you guys have any input or anything, just feel free to add as well. Yeah. Here, this is from a different photographer. This is Kunle AJAYI in, I believe in Nigeria. And so it's showing a event where, I think it's Jenni, or how do you pronounce it, is a Chinese cell phone company, and they're sort of unleashing their new product line throughout Africa. So as many of you may be aware, there's a lot of the electronic goods that are being sold in Africa are Chinese products, right? They're more affordable to a lot of the people there. So I think this is a very interesting photograph in terms of subject matter as well, because I think this is something that's really changing a lot of the society, the culture throughout Africa with electronic goods. You know, now a lot of people have smartphones where they used to not be able to, have them. And so I think Chinese technology is really playing a huge role in shaping local societies. And so I also really like this photograph because it almost appears kind of like a portrait of a sense of society, of the Nigerians there. So in a way, and then of course you have in the background the banners of the company, the brand that is being sold. So in a way, it kind of feels kind of like a portrait, but a very natural one. Here on this side, we also have another photograph, also from a different photographer, Megan McPHADEN. This one is a woman from Tanzania who is dressed in local clothing, but here you'll see that she's also wearing a pouch that's holding a Chinese smartphone. And according to her, this so I think what's interesting here is you see within just one frame something that's very traditional, and then something that's very high tech. So this kind of, I think in photography, the ability to combine different things, new and old, the irony that may come out of it is very poignant. So I think that's why I think this photograph is also very strong in its narrative. And also maybe talking about the way in which technology then is now influencing our lives throughout Africa. So I think the technology is one of those stories that are very interesting. So here, moving forward, I think we have several other, you'll see that there are many different kinds of stories that are being told. In these two images here by John OMONDI, these are Kenyans who are trying out new agricultural machine, like hand tractors that are imported from China. So you can see how these photographs really talk about how imported machinery, new kind of technologies are then changing the way local Africans are, plowing fields and so forth. And so here as well, in relation to agriculture, from Gaspard MAHEBURWA, in Burundi, we have Chinese experts giving advice to local authorities on our experimentation field. So here they're growing rice, and we have people from China advising them on growth. And here you also have from Peter, this is a Chinese manufacturing factory in Nigeria. So the Chinese have built many free trade zones throughout the continent, and often, in many cases, they operate as manufacturing logistical hubs for Chinese companies or as well as local companies. So I think this is a great photograph in a way. It's showing kind of this new type of space that's proliferating across the continent. Yeah.
For this image here, this actually was produced by a journalist in Burundi, Gaspard MAHEBURWA. And what's interesting about this photo is it actually shows a whole new strain of rice produced by, it's produced by a Chinese company, and it's like a high-growing type of rice, a hybrid type of rice. And this is how they are discussing how the rice is, how best to grow the rice. And so it's actually, there's a lot in this photo that's maybe not immediately apparent.
Right, I don't have a lot to say because luckily for me, both photos were taken at the same place. But I was very lucky in that almost 2 years ago now, I did an investigation also supported by this project into the Confucius Institutes in 3 African countries, Zambia, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe, and specifically looking into soft power and how those institutes and the language and culture that they teach are potentially shaping views of China in Africans' minds. And I say I was lucky because I landed in Dar es Salaam, I guess direct from Cape Town, yeah. And the organizers of the directors of the Confucius Institute had been very non-committal about meeting me and very vague about whether they'd be there or whether they'd be a holiday or, I got their phone numbers and arrived, and they said, oh, we're at this event, why don't you come? And that was the event you see in the bottom picture. So this was at a primary school on the campus of University of Dar es Salaam. University of Dar es Salaam has its own Confucius Institute, which I think everyone knows what they are, but they're the Beijing-funded language and culture centers. And then on the campus, this very large campus of University of Dar es Salaam, there is this primary school where they decided to pilot a Chinese language project as it was convenient and close to the Confucius Institute, so they could just send the teachers like a 15-minute walk away. And this is the result of the end of the first course in the primary school, and this was the award ceremony that I witnessed. So it's an internationally recognized Chinese certificate called the Chinese Youth Certificate, which you can see. They've got the Chinese characters and then the English underneath. And one by one, the children who had passed this test were asked to come up. They all were asked to have exactly the same photo taken, which is partly just for record's sake and partly as maybe a keepsake for them. But it's also very much a part of China's method of spreading the word about what they are doing and their cultural diplomacy in African schools. So this Chinese woman was the director of the Dar es Salaam Confucius Institute. Then her co-director, who's a Tanzanian man, also a professor. There's always a local and a Chinese director at each of these Confucius Institutes. And then the staff diligently lining up to make sure they get the photo for probably Xinhua, or these photos get disseminated to support what one of our speakers called the Sunshine and Roses version of the China and Africa story. That's the main event. Directly after the award ceremony, the children were asked to raise their hand if they were interested in taking a course, new students for the new beginners course. And quite a few of them did. And the professor, the Tanzanian professor said, okay, great, well, we can start classes next week. But the Chinese director said, no way, we're starting today. We're starting right now. And it was kind of a bit of a culture clash. It was like 3 in the afternoon. Everyone wanted to go home. but she wanted the students who were interested to commit and to start their beginner course right then and there. So we moved over into about 4 different classrooms. I followed this teacher into this classroom. Yeah, long story short, they learned the very basics. If you can't, speak Chinese, then you might want to know that basically those sentences just say, so it's like, 我爱妈妈, like I love mom or mama, mother loves me, I love father, father loves me. So like very basic sentence. But the teacher, very cleverly, and many other teachers who I encountered, played a lot on the similarities or commonalities between languages. So I think mama is mother in so many languages, so it was kind of an easy word for them to learn at first. And that was him teaching the class, and as it happens, it was his first ever class. He had a qualification that is conducted through Hanban, the Chinese language teaching organization, but that was the first class he ever taught. He did very well, the kids loved him. I managed to see how it was done, and that's the end of the story. Thanks for exhibiting them.
Thanks, Claire. So I was just telling Claire too how I love I love mom as such a universal language. So it's just even within that photograph, there's a very universal element that's tying two very different peoples together. So yeah, that's I think why this picture is particularly powerful. If you understand if you can read Chinese as well.
When I went to Cyril Dean, just right next to Bruma Estate, I saw these ladies, and one thing that fascinated me was seeing Chinese people actually buying something from, Africans, because I've never seen that. So obviously they are restaurant owners, and they buy coconut and they buy other organic fruits from the ladies. So this was actually, fascinating for me. And when I saw this, it's relating to Africa-China relations, where now I can see, that whole, it's not battering, but buying and selling and, trading, so that's what, when I took this picture, that's what I had in mind. So yeah, thank you so much for exhibiting. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Well, glad you can join too. I didn't know you were here. So yeah, here I think like what she was saying, trade and exchange is very much like a central element of China and Africa relations. So I think this picture does capture very well sort of that exchange that's happening. Here above this photograph, Katherine Chen takes a photo of Chinese tourists in Lake Nakuru in Kenya. So again, a very different story, a very different photograph. Showing a different facet, more about tourism. Apparently in this lake, a Chinese tourist was also killed by a hippo in 2018. I'm not sure why she mentioned that, if there was, very close to that spot. Maybe there's an irony in play in that photograph or not, but I think, photographs can offer a wide array of very different types of narratives. Some has irony, some is about exchange, some is more about documentation, some are more about intimate kind of encounters between China and Africa. So like here you can really see a very wide spectrum of different narratives being played out through photography. So yeah. Moving here, I guess these two photographs are the two photographs I've taken. Maybe I can shed some light on it. As an architect, I'm very interested in urban development. How is transnational infrastructure, how are China's Africa relationships, since it's so centered on construction, shaping the urban future of many African cities. So, so when I was in Africa for 8 months, I was shooting a lot of buildings, development projects, infrastructure projects, and so forth. So this is a housing development in Kalulushi in Zambia, in the Copper Belt. And for me, what I guess was so interesting about this photograph is how repeatable the buildings look. And this is something it looks very stale, it looks very banal, it looks very empty. At the time, no one was there. I had to climb a water tower to take this photo. There was no drones at that time, so So it was very interesting. No one was living in this town. There was only one security guard, and essentially, because a lot of people couldn't afford to buy these houses. But so I think there's a very interesting kind of difference between the very informal aspect of a lot of like the African markets, the kind of where people kind of custom build their own houses, and there's kind of a lot of variety and vibrance behind that. And then you have something very kind of manufactured, which is what you see in this photograph. Very repeatable houses, they all look the same, it's all rigid in the same line. And I feel like with a lot of new developments happening in Africa, this is kind of the type of housing and building development that you see appearing everywhere. Satellite towns, gated communities. And so is this the kind of future that we are seeing with development happening, right? And is this the kind of future, urban future that we want to see throughout the continent? So that's why I took a photo like this, to kind of express its repeatable kind of nature. Here, this is a totally different story. I spent 3 days with this Chinese entrepreneur in Zambia. He works for a water bottling plant in Zambia, and what was so interesting about it was I was able to kind of follow him and kind of observe how he lived his life. So this is a very kind of social aspect of the story rather than something like this. And so what was interesting was he had this ambition to create his own water bottling plant in the Copper Belt. So here he is showing me a site where there's a natural hot spring like right behind him. And there were a lot of local men just watching themselves and enjoying the hot spring. And then he's telling me that he wants to buy up this hot spring so that he can essentially create his own water bottling and water kind of plant at the site. So I think it's a very interesting kind of analogy of China-African relations, where on the one hand, the locals can really enjoy their natural kind of resources right, at hand here. And then you have someone like China where they are trying to, yes, they are buying up you know, property and resources and owning them, but at the same time with the ambition to try to kind of multiply it and to distribute it to many more people. So I think it's a kind of an interesting analogy on a very personal scale of what's happening throughout China and Africa. So here he's kind of scouting out land, documenting the site while the guys behind him are enjoying the hot spring. Here we're back to this original photographer, Yuyang, who again was the one who won this competition. The reason why I think this photograph is so powerful is also because of the way kind of the foreground is interacting with the background, right? So in the foreground you have a local fisherman, and then staring out at a Chinese reefer ship heading towards Dhaka in the background. You can tell by the Chinese characters on the ship. So sometimes, especially when you document China-Africa relations, elements like Chinese characters do really play a big role as well in telling the story who may never have been to Africa to understand like kind of what's happening. So Chinese characters, or for example, or local elements like local dresses do play a big role in telling a story, what kind of elements you include and don't include. We're going to wrap up very quickly here. This is another photograph I really love. Jenni Marsh submitted this photograph of a production line in Ethiopia. So in Ethiopia, it's a huge manufacturing scene right now, and here they're building manufacturing shoes. And the reason why I think this photograph is so powerful is because it looks very manufactured in a way. Everyone's sort of, it looks like a production line that you would find in China. So the association of like a Chinese factory in Africa then kind of there's this association now that China is now trying to bring manufacturing into Africa. Not to mention the clothing, red and yellow, has a close resemblance to the Chinese flag, right? So all of a sudden, the kind of manufactured element of the photograph combined with the colors of China, and then even the Chinese characters inside the photograph, but with local Africans inside the photograph working, it really tells you a lot about the state of manufacturing in Africa right now. Here, we have a very local market in Nigeria, but all the fabric and textiles are from China. So there's a very strong, there's a lot of things are being imported, exported between China and Africa. And so a lot of the items that you see in Africa are actually coming from China now. So there's even a lot about visual culture, visual material that is being documented throughout photography that can then be, that can really tell the story as well. And then finally, we have this is also a photograph by Jenni Marsh, who shot this one as well, of a gelatin capsule factory in Ethiopia. So I assume this is a Chinese factory where they're manufacturing medicine pills for in Ethiopia. So again, a very different angle to the story, but very related to manufacturing and bringing offshoring manufacturing to Africa. Finally, last but not least, we have Romain and Gerald here, who can also maybe explain a little bit about this photograph that they've taken.
Yeah, so this picture is taken in downtown Joburg. And now for those who are familiar, this is towards the eastern section of Commissioner Street, where there was the first Chinatown. It's near John Foster Square, near the police station, and where the sheds are now located. So I took this picture of Walter Pon, who's the owner. He's a South African-born Chinese whose parents are both teachers. They moved to South Africa quite a long time ago, and a very large family, he was put in charge of running the family business, which is Soy Hing Hong that you can see at the background. So it's basically, before the second Chinatown emerged, was the largest rice importer in the country. So the family is quite powerful, also to some extent shaping the voice of what is going on in that area. So, and Uncle Walter, as people call him who know him, is always being seen as the unofficial mayor of First Chinatown. So he's also been very involved in trying to upgrade the area. So for me, this is more a story about how does a person, the coming of age of a street, but also the coming of age of a man, and how his engagement with the street. So here you can see that they had this very ambitious plans with the precinct plan in First Chinatown to put up gates and everything. And eventually, the usual story, the city didn't have enough money, not enough interest. And so they ended up setting up 2 dragon statues and had 2 historical kind of, landmarks in a certain way that were drawn out of a book that's kind of like the Bible of Chinese presence in South Africa. I mean, the historic presence written by Melanie Yap and Diane Mann. So it kind of like contextualizes the story and refers to the past in a way. So, but what is interesting as well is that whereas First Chinatown is always referred to the memory and the kind of old presence of Chinese, there are current struggles going on. It's also a story about how this street relates to the rest of the city. How do people try to reinvent themselves in order to stay open? And Walter Pon always says, as soon as he's gone, nothing's going to be happening to the street anymore, because lots of businesses have moved to the new Chinatown area. Then the other thing that is also of interest, now I lost my train of thought, is that within the area there are not that many old Chinese living there anymore. You still have the old families coming there for some yam cha, some dim sum, in order to reconnect with their Cantonese side. But if you go to the area, there are lots of Indian, Pakistani, and also a few mainland Chinese living there, but without direct connection to the area. They just live there because it's in proximity of the CBD and a proximity of Chinese-run malls or the Ethiopian quarter, or like really wholesale trading. So for them, they live there because it's in proximity of economic activities. And it's kind of like different to that other picture in Geraldine, where you can see, I live in that area, so those women that you can see in front of are actually from Mozambique, and they also bring in on a Friday afternoon, you can see the Chinese queue up because they sell squids and all sorts of seafood, and you can see a whole line of Chinese trying to get stuff from them. And the banner, sorry, I don't want to overtalk your picture, I just wanted to add a little bit more. The banner that you can see is one of the prime land for Chinese, because there used to be 4 plots for houses that have been earmarked for development of some developer from Shanghai who went AWOL, because he was deported, but he had put down an application to develop a mall along that street. So, but for now, this 4 plots of land by the value of 16 million rand, just the empty land, are still vacant, and they have been vacant for quite some time. So it's this interesting idea of how these areas relate to certain perception of Chineseness, but they're also undergoing like tremendous changes, and that is something that those areas are not static, although they appear as static from the outside. So, thanks.
Well, as usual, it's wonderful to come to another forum where I get the opportunity to meet really fascinating journalists from Africa and beyond who are doing really interesting investigations into, for me, the most interesting aspect is mostly on-the-ground China-Africa relations. And the element of this photographic exhibition has been really great too. So I'm happy to be here for another year, and I look forward to writing down some of the ideas I had during the process and potentially developing them into another article for next year.
So this year we hosted our first photo exhibition that shed light on how we represent the China and Africa relations. So we've invited a lot of people to submit their photographs for this exhibition as shown here, and we've chosen one winner in this exhibition. His name is Yuyang. And you can see he has focused on the issue of overfishing in West Africa. And the reason why his photographs are just so powerful is because he really draws us into his story through the images that he's shown, whether it's the way he frames the subjects, or it's the mood, or what the people inside the photographs are, how they are relating to each other. That makes it so particularly powerful. But overall, I think the photographs submitted have been really impressive. They're very expansive in covering many different types of stories, and I think they do show a lot more of a personal and more visual angle to the story that I think should be told.
And I had a really wonderful time at the forum. It was great to see so many journalists who are actively involved on the China-Africa stories about Africa-China engagement, and I made some interesting contacts, did some networking. I'm looking forward to being able to work with some people on my next film, which will be the sequel to Guangzhou Dream Factory, which will look at Chinese presence in Africa, hopefully following some of the Africans that I work with in Guangzhou as they try to head back to their countries to set up businesses with their Chinese partners.
So one of the things that I think one of the most important things that came up from the discussion today was how we need to reassess our narratives about the China-Africa relationship. We need to look at nuance, have more context to it, and I think a lot of the participants today brought a breadth of knowledge about the discussion.
Today was filled with just fascinating conversations. What really stood out for me, both talking about our book Poacher, but also a common thread in a lot of other conversations, was how important personal stories and human narratives are, telling stories with nuance, sidestepping what can be quite rigid ways of telling stories, so that we can actually find a common language to speak to each other and understand what's really going on.
I think this conference is great because I get to learn a lot about what African journalists they are thinking, what they are seeing about Chinese in Africa, what are the social and environmental challenges, and the kind of challenges that like China and Africa need to work together to sort it out.